Hi. I may have gotten distracted. Push and pull. When I say that, what comes to mind? Is it the moon pulling and pushing the tide, yin and yang? Tui and La? If it's the entirety of Nod-Krai, you'd also be right. But while I was sitting around thinking of what I wanted this video to be, a realization came to me. Could the dynamic of push and pull apply to more than just the mechanics, world building, and the elements? The answer is yes, absolutely. Opposites attract is a heavily used concept in Nod-Krai, and I want to explore that. Welcome to the lore then. I'm Eladon, and today we will be tackling the push and pull dynamics between the characters of Nod-Krai. But before that, allow me to give some context for the uninitiated related to Nod-Krai. Nod-Krai is the birthplace of the three moons and the Trilunar sisters, who were created by the Dragon King Nibelung. It is the second completely independent nation that is not underneath the protection of one of the seven archons of Tevat, though the Fatui would like to argue that is not entirely the case, considering that Nod-Krai is on the southern borders of Snezhnaya, and thus it should belong to Her Royal Majesty the Tsaritsa. Nod-Krai is also the birthplace of the Kutar, otherwise known as the Moon Maiden, or Columbina. She is the current incarnation of the Frost Moon Goddess, not a direct reincarnation mind you, just an incarnation. The entire situation regarding who Nod-Krai belongs to is debated a lot between the people themselves, so there's quite literally not an actual answer. Regardless, now before I actually jump into it, I'd like to preface this with a potential spoiler ahead to anyone who hasn't finished the Nod-Krai Arc Conquest. Starting with the first main duo we meet in Nod-Krai, Aino and Inefa. The dynamic between Aino and Inefa is really interesting because theirs is that of creator and creation, yet also caretaker and care recipient. Inefa is rational, calm, blunt, tidy, and a little dense. Aino is irrational, hasty, messy, and has a pretty decent social awareness considering her age. Whenever Inefa and Aino are on screen, you'll often see them enacting one of these three encounters. Aino trying to get snacks that exceed her dietary limit, Inefa and Aino debating personhood, and giving each other reminders such as chores and carrying stuff for one another or baking crumb cakes for Aino. The charm between Aino and Inefa is that they almost never are on the same page in any way that is entirely harmonious at a first glance. Even when their goals are aligned, their methods and ideas are entirely different. For example, during the Nod-Krai Arc Conquest, at times, Inefa will always caution Aino and insist on perhaps going about something in a more diplomatic manner, while Aino is already midway through mobilizing her Kling-Clank bots to turn the entirety of Nod-Krai upside down to get what she wants, like in that one event where someone stole her robot and she beat up a guy. Other times, they collaborate together, covering each other's blind spots, such as when they were trying to stop the Kuvaki cannon from firing and fulfilling a step in Rerir's plan. They were able to stand up to Knuckle Duckle, a very powerful robot created by Aino, with relative ease, and that is because they trusted one another to behave in certain ways in which they didn't have to account for. Despite their bickering and disagreements, they really are fully capable of acting in unison. Inefa is fully aware of Aino's needs at all times and makes sure to try her hardest to fulfill them, like creating sweets in Shake's schedule or helping Aino build more friends or just trying to work on her humor for her. But what's actually interesting is the heart behind it all. Much like gravity, it belongs in a balance, and Aino's and Inefa's is that of love, familial love. Despite their disagreements and different forms of actions, almost everything they do is in response to one another, and most of the time for the better. Inefa went away from Nod-Krai to travel to Natlan because she wanted to secure her family, to regain her memories, and the biggest motivator, the one that brought Inefa back from the edge, was Aino. And Aino fights like hell for her robots because she wants the people to see their innate values as personalities themselves, and much like the occasional full moon, their teamwork is astounding. When push comes to shove and they work together, they are nearly unstoppable, even managing to come up with ways and methods to counteract against one of the 5 sinners of Conria, by fooling him with decoys while the group was trying to aid Columbina in regaining enough strength to take on the Rayhir of Solari. For the uninitiated, again, they used Columbina's Kuvaki signature to create distractions in the form of planted decoys across Nod-Krai's map. Aino made them with Inefa's help, and they used Inefa's speed to place them all around Nod-Krai. Where Aino is too slow or perhaps naive, Inefa will carry her or aid her in the task, or protect her from any ill actors. Where Inefa needs repairs or improvement in her quality of life, Aino is there to make all of her metaphorical dreams come true. They improve each other's quality of life, and you honestly can't look at them without thinking, wow, this dynamic would be empty without X or Y. And that you'll find is actually a rather common dynamic relation between these weirdos. A good example being Lama the Moonchanter of Frostmoon Science and Nefer, the boss of the Curatorium of Secrets. These two on their own are magnificently written characters. Their personalities are clearly set out to the point where you can instantaneously tell whether or not they'd get along with each other. And you'd kinda sorta maybe be right. There is not a world out there in which they'd get along like ordinary people. For some context on their identities, Lauma is a religious figure. She is the moon chanter of the Frost Moon Scions and the closest one to Kutar. In this case literally, and the leader of the Scions of the Frost Moon. Like the perceived virtues of their goddess, Lauma is a kind, gentle, and honest individual who also has a surprising teasing streak. She holds herself to 3 values that she tries, or tried to, not to break no matter what. A moon chanter must never be wrathful, angry. A moon chanter must never lie, and she must never change from her benevolent nature. At the same time, Lauma is notoriously stubborn, though not in the inconvenient way people usually are. She's the type of absolutely insistent stubborn. On proper procedures like marriage ceremonies between a Frostmoon Scion and her lover, or always insistent on doing the right thing the right way regarding the danger. When it comes to these, Lauma is as unmovable as the Geo Archon's obsession with contracts. Nefer, on the other hand, is the boss of the Curatorium of Secrets. Shrewd and secretive, she's always looking to make a profit, as well as garner valuable intel, sometimes to an infuriating degree. She's the type to ask for payment even when the entire world is in danger. Thankfully, Yahora is often there to try and persuade her to help. Can I just rant about how stupid that is? Like, girl, the world is in danger. Who cares about being paid? Anyway, the help that comes at the cost of Yahora's quality of life usually ends up being in Yahora paying it out of her pockets or being taken out of her salary. That, and she's also Nefer's one and only employee. She is the chosen of the Ibis King, Thoth. Having answered his 3rd question, what determines truth and falsehood? Upon her answer, she received a gift from him, a chest set box that would allow her to perceive a person's past or secrets. She's the polar opposite of Lauma, dishonest, wrathful, at least in the past, and not to mention ever-changing depending on what she needs to take advantage of in a situation. Now, what makes these 2 completely different individuals work well together? In this case, it's almost like an unstoppable force meets immovable object type of case. They can't get the win out on one another, so they just go back and forth constantly. A pretty convincing tell for this argument is actually something Varka once jokingly stated, that if he ever needed to convince Nefer about something, he should just get Lauma instead of trying to do it himself. That already tells us that despite all appearances pointing to otherwise, they have a good relationship. Otherwise, Nefer would just outright refuse and not budge on any of Lauma's requests, regardless of how pushy Lauma got. After all, Nefer is not a pushover. You don't do these kinds of favors, nor bend your intel broker company's main rules so often if you're just acquaintances or dislike one another. Nefer aids Lauma in many cases, such as sending Yahora to help Lauma investigate the loss of the Frostmoon Scion's marrow. Yeah, sure, she fired Yahora in order to keep her business neutrality policy, but let's be real, Yahora was never really fired. That was just to give Nefer clause for absolute deniability towards the Fatui. Likewise, Lauma is always there at the ready whenever Nefer would be risking her eyes using the chess set of the Ibis King. Lauma has demonstrated many times that she has an unrivaled healing power thanks to her silver blood and Frostmoon Scion medicine practices. Even so far as pulling off the impossible and restoring Nefer's eyesight after she looked too far back in the past. Lauma demonstrates that she can pick up on Nefer's language and easily pick up to it. One moment she's as gentle as a moon chanter is expected to be, the other she's poking at Nefer until Nefer gives in to her demands. Funnily enough, it usually ends up being at Yahora's expense. Literally. It's almost as if Lauma can bring out Nefer's more genuine side. We can tell that by the fact that Nefer changes her mindset midway through the entire mission, something a professional like her wouldn't do considering the context of the change. She's willingly risking her life without much persuasion, when in the past she was dead set on the price, or a certain reimbursements or safety measures. Meanwhile, Nefer's harsher side actually influences Lauma in a positive way too. When it comes to her more passive nature, as far as we can tell, the 2 did not have that many interactions in the past before the Nod-Krai Archon quests. And as we know, Lauma has always been a more hesitant and careful individual. Honestly, it was one of her core principles after all. When it comes to Nefer's influence on her, we can see it in how Lauma begins to banter more with Flints, who she used to avoid like the plague, or act in more assertive ways in cases outside of encounters with the Fatui, though admittedly, those tend to be the main source of conflict for her anyway. Nefer's trickery seems to have rubbed off on Lauma quite a lot. Either that or Lauma secretly has a devious side that is willing to play dirty, especially when it comes to retrieving lost material. Regardless, a scene tends to feel complete when the 2 of them are on screen, and I can see why many people are fans of this duo. They bicker like an old married couple, and in certain cases act in each other's benefit like one too. Sounds a lot like a certain Lightkeeper. Speaking of him, I was actually going to do a singular duo, but oh my god, does he have chemistry with literally every single character in this nation. Even in a YouTube video script, Flynn finds a way to be difficult. Flynn's manner of complimenting others is at both times genuine and also manipulative. It is quite difficult to tell his aristocratic manners from simple kindness and chivalry, and perhaps there is little difference between that. I have to say, I respect his way of getting out of things he doesn't want to do. Now, how exactly does this guy influence everyone, and more importantly, how do they influence him? Despite every single appearance he's had, he's still as inscrutable now as he was before. First off, let's start with how he influences others, or gets along with others, namely Lauma, Aino, Nefer, Traveler, Paimon, Eilua, Farka, and Durin. Flynn's defining feature is that he is incredibly, ridiculously so, off-putting to literally everybody. For example, a simple offer to escort Ullman to the docks of Nausea Town comes off as a Fae-themed adventure that scares a poor soul half to death. All the while, Flynn's is just being nice, handling the situation and protecting him from the Wild Hunt. What a gentleman. Likewise, when the Traveler and Paimon first meet him, their, or rather Paimon's, first instinct is how weird he is. Lauma was also on high guard after the battle against the Wild Hunt and using her power. You get the gist, he freaks people out. He's also a bad student, either tricking Aino with sweets to get her to be distracted or missing out for reasons. Yeah, sure. At the same time, he always flatters them up so that he can get out of responsibilities he doesn't want to do. Anyone who thinks he's entirely genuine can be seen as a little naive in his eyes. It's kind of crazy cool how many aspects, scenes, and relations you can find between characters when only having quite a small amount of characteristics. Regardless, he is the type of character who can get along with everyone to a certain degree, the jack of all trades, master of none. Looking back on the Archon quest, I recall moments in which Durin and Flynn sat down to talk about life, death, and the willingness to save others. During the prelude to the Moon Prayer Night, Durin felt deeply for the phantoms that were losing their lives to the abyssal monsters again and again, always trying to help them and never succeeding. When it began bringing Durin down, Flynn's had a heart-to-heart with him. Naturally, Flynn's experienced loss before in waves. Unlike Durin, he knew how to compartmentalize, as well as learn to merely try to do his best in such situations. It was already quite telling that Durin's many attempts had not broken him, and that he continued to believe that he could aid the phantoms. Something I noticed about Flynn's is his adaptability. It reminds me a little bit of Farina, who while playing the Hydro Archon, felt as if she was acting as different people all the time. Whether it came from aligning with Albedo's background character energy wisdom, or joking with Varka about awkward silence, it always seems like he's pulling people in rather than pushing. Quite ironic, considering that during Act 2, he did everything in his power to push his fellow Lightkeepers aside. Eilua, known as the Big Shot in the Lightkeepers, had always visited him at the ruined lighthouse, bringing him supplies, checking in on him. Unnecessary though it may be, it shows he has at least a somewhat amicable relationship with his fellow faction. Even when he went missing, he only did so because the Wild Hunt anomalies were following him, particularly Rerir's corpse, I guess. But as I see it, his semi-genuine praise is meant to encourage people and get them to succeed. For example, whenever Yahoda hesitates to do something, which is often due to the danger of the situations, Flynn's is one of the first people to, well, politely manipulate her into going through with it anyway. For example, in Varka's story quest, yes, I know, I'm slow, okay? I had different kind of situations going on at the time. Now hush. When Yahoda is put in charge of comms, made to trudge through hordes of Wild Hunt monsters back and forth, Flynn immediately jumps on the, "Oh wow, you're doing this for us? That is so courageous of you, Miss Yahoda" train. We already know Yahoda leans towards doing such things anyway, but considering her common sense and hesitancy to die, I think it was a smart move to make sure her ego wouldn't let her back out on this. Now that I think about it, the only person, or I suppose people, if we consider Nefer, who are kind of immune to this effect of his is Eilua. With Eilua, Flynn feels at the outset at least like a person forced into down-to-earth discussion. When it came to evacuating the entirety of Nod-Krai between Natlan and Snezhnaya, Eilua and Flynn met up to discuss it. Something that stood out to me is how they showed to each other a different type of care. Eilua is straightforward, very passionate, and quite quick to escalate in his care. Meanwhile, with Flynn, it is hard to say whether he was treating him with kindness or like an older brother looking down on their super emotional sibling. Considering that Flynn is a rather nice guy, let's assume he was very flattered by Eilua's passionate anger on his behalf for being cursed by Dottore. It's like Flynn's sides are balanced, in a sense at least. Consider this, an entity, no matter how they go about it, will always see things in a different way, like with Neuvillette, for example, who never much understood humans or the lives they lead. In Flynn's case, it's kind of similar, but not. What I'm trying to get at here is that the people he has met during his time in Nod-Krai have helped him keep himself anchored to his humanity, in a sense. Of course, he's not half human or anything, but it keeps him grounded. Much like a nobleman who goes out to explore the world before inheriting his estate, so too has Flynn's experienced many things that have helped him maintain his connections to more humane aspects of his personality. For entities outside of the human race in Tevat, a lot of them make perfect humans, if you would. Speaking of, that leads us to possibly my favorite duo, the perfect example of the push and pull dynamic, Columbina and Sandrone. A canonically confirmed to be very unlikely friendship, which somehow bloomed from similarities in completely different personalities. What stands out about their friendship is how comfortable they are with one another. Whether it's Columbina rage-baiting Sandrone, or Sandrone shouting at Columbina at the top of her voice and telling her to scram, they're always bringing out the more genuine aspects of one another. Consider this. When Weekend, Columbina was acting out of character. She was airheaded, dissociative, innocent, and uncaring. Exactly like Wanderer described her. She only regains some of that personality back when she uses the moon mirrors to regain some of her power. But what stands out to me is how Sandrone is able to bring out some of that personality in Columbina without even needing Columbina to have that level of power. What is really nice about all of this is that their bickering is not really coming out of any ill will or malice. Even Sandrone, who like most of the Vatui believed the Pale Star Edict, which was an order from the Tsaritsa herself, an order to retrieve Columbina at no matter the cost, she didn't even take it all that seriously. Not to mention Columbina, who is fully aware that there's a warrant out on her head, waltzes into the Vatui Experimental Design Bureau simply because Sandrone is there, and she most definitely can't imagine Sandrone going after her or causing her harm. Granted, it was either that or she gets found and killed by the Rehir of Solnari, but you get the idea. Their first priorities are themselves and their friend. Which is actually something that does get semi-addressed in the Archon quests. Sandrone's defining feature is her absolute and ironic distaste for saviors, or in her words, deluded individuals who dream of saving the world. Yes, I've seen all the comments pointing out the irony. You know who you are. I see you, Steve. So, she ends up giving everything to Columbina to return to the present times, aka Columbina's future, which coincidentally saves the world. One often meets his destiny on the road he takes to avoid it, as they say. In this case, that road dragged Marionette kicking and screaming. Now, you'd think that for such a big act of devotion, there would be an equivalent act from the other side, considering that's the entire point of the video. But that is also not really the case. It's not exactly that Columbina hasn't done anything for Sandrone either, though. For the most part, Columbina's been a freeloader for ages, but despite all her newly found boundaries and thoughts on her power, especially after achieving the Trilunar Authority, she decides one selfish thing for herself. And for the context of the matter, Columbina believes that just because she can turn the whole world upside down now, doesn't mean she should. She differentiates home from a possession, and that makes her attempt to wake Sandrone up particularly touching. It strangely enough doesn't work, which in my view is the writer's way of going, I've got different plans for this one. But as for lore explanations, I guess that the power over reality itself doesn't make you a good mechanic. It's difficult to say whether the core itself was damaged when the Torai destroyed her body, or if her body specifically was tied to the core's stability, in which case she really is gone. But I will cope. In any case, in basically any fictional story, the power to bring dead people back from the dead is, well, always going to end up in a monstrous undead akin to monkey's paw situation. So the fact Columbina tried to do so anyway is quite significant if you ask me. Something that just came to mind is actually that their dynamic never fully resolves, at least not during Nod-Krai Archon quests. Take Kunroko's night, for example. During the celebrations, Sandrone comes in personally to check in on Columbina, despite personal embarrassment and weird looks from onlookers. When she runs into her, she gets called out in 0.0 seconds, and successfully gets rage-baited by being told if she loses a round in their game, Columbina will bash her head in or something along those lines. Of course, once that's all said and done, they embrace, and once again, one draws the other in while the other tries to push the other one away. Except this time, that's not what happens. Sandrone gets her first hug since who knows how long, maybe even ever considering her reaction, and before she could return it, Columbina pulls away for presumably the final time. Little do they know, am I right? And then, as she watches Columbina leave, she lets out a quiet, "I'll miss you too." And I cannot state how important that is because this is Sandrone. She does genuinely have a terrible personality. She's a tsundere, and imagine how horrible it'd be to deal with one in real life. So the fact she has a genuine connection to Columbina, despite how difficult it is for her to show it in a normal sense, is telling. And you don't put up with someone like that for so long unless they genuinely mean something to you. Which reminds me of their rather individualistic and independent natures. They don't want to do things for people they don't know, and if anything, they'd rather live to their own comfort at all times if they could. Ironically, this rather distant approach to relationships brings them closer rather than pulling them apart. Sandrone gave up her life so that she could bring Columbina back. None of this would have been possible without Sandrone's work. Ironically, that helped save the world. Don't we just love how ironic this game can be? Pure poetry, honestly. Speaking of poetry, I'd be loath to speak on the dynamics of characters without at least talking about the Traveler and Paimon. Since the beginning of the game, we could witness the progression of the Traveler and Paimon's relationship. More so in later arcs than before, because the Traveler had no personality until like Inazuma. The Traveler had lost their sibling, and the closest person they have right now is Paimon. When the Traveler first woke up, they didn't know the language of this world, and even worse, had no idea about the general knowledge or just the whole layout of the world. So as much as we hate to admit it, Paimon is, well, rather crucial to the Traveler's beginning in Tevat. A good thing they saved Paimon from literally drowning in that lake. Pond? Paimon even floating, she's still limited by the stamina system. The Traveler is not much of a talker, and whether it may have been from imperfect language skills or just being more of a listener or witness, it's hard to say, so Paimon filled in that role of the speaker, sometimes to the benefit of the group and sometimes not by stealing the Traveler's ideas before they even got a chance to voice them. But what I think makes this duo functional and perhaps even necessary is that the Traveler's entire goal is being reunited with their sibling. As far as they're concerned, they could be less functional without someone else to balance them out. And even though she's kinda weak and useless, she kind of acts like the Jiminy Cricket of the duo. Sometimes the Traveler just outright doesn't want to help, and either the characters themselves like Ayaka or Paimon try their best to get the Traveler on board. My personal favorite is Paimon's insistence that they should stop trying to leave quietly to continue their journey, having set up an entire farewell party in Natlan with the help of the others just to have a chance to have a feast and say goodbye before they went ahead to Nod-Krai. Funnily enough, they often appear more like siblings than their best friends, ribbing on each other but always being there for one another as each other's first priority. When the doctor kidnapped the Traveler to try to convert them to his side, and mind you, we still have no idea what he wanted from that, he never answered the Traveler's question. Paimon was tripping over her own emotions at every turn, which honestly, it was very touching. It made me wonder, what would the Traveler be like if the roles were reversed? Who am I kidding, of course? The Traveler seems like the type who would turn all of Tevat upside down just to save or help Paimon out. They uplift one another, and when one stumbles, the other one picks up the task of being their shoulder to cry on, or their pillar. In Natlan during the war against the Abyss, it was likely that it was Paimon's first war. I believe this was the moment in which the image that the two of them were solid together as a team first appeared. Seeing the destruction and death caused by this conflict shook her to her core, and although like many, including a Pyro Archon herself, she didn't have time to dwell on it, she still felt for everyone, and the Traveler named it as it is, war. During much of the story of Natlan, Paimon took a sort of naive child role, and the Traveler took the role of a guide for once, helping Paimon plant her feet into the ground despite feeling like she couldn't handle it. And it pays off in Nod-Krai. While the Traveler is gone, she steels herself, thinks about what the Traveler would do, and does her best to aid the efforts against the Torre, which in the end helps everyone. I do genuinely believe that if we didn't have Paimon with us on our journey, the journey itself would be way different. I'm excited to see how the development between these two characters continues as we travel into Snezhnaya in the next patch. Well, not next patch, but you know what I mean. The divine ideal of the Cryo Archon is that of love, so I'm curious to see how Genshin Impact is going to explore the dynamic between characters when it comes to love, because there's so many ways to understand it. So this was way longer than expected for a second video after the first was like 10 minutes. Super sorry for the delay. Honestly, writing the script for the video was the worst part. I tend to ramble, and I like to get my thoughts out there in as true as nature as I can. Digging up thoughts and putting them in a vaguely cohesive structure is really hard. The next video should be far easier to write about though. Stay tuned for the ideal next topic shall be the entirety of the history of Sumeru. See you later!